Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I hope you're having a great week. Well, this week's mental health tip has to do with laughter. When was it last time that you had a really good laugh? Was it maybe you were hanging out with friends and were talking about some funny stuff and just cracked up? Maybe you were watching a movie or a television show. Well, whatever the case, I was doing some research this week on the Mayo Clinic website, and I found out that laughter actually has some benefits for all of us. One of the things I found out is that it stimulates our organs, things like our heart and our lungs, our muscles. And you know those neurotransmitters called endorphins? Well, laughter stimulates the release of endorphins that makes us feel good. Also, kind of related to this is I found out that laughter helps relieve our stress. So, you know, when you're all stressed out, if you look at how this affects us physiologically, it increases our heart rate, our blood pressure. And, you know, if that goes on for a long period of time on a consistent basis, that's not really good for us. So if we can engage in laughter, it'll actually have the opposite effect where it'll help lower heart rate, decrease blood pressure, helps us feel better. And of course, if we feel better, we don't feel as tense, we feel our muscles are more relaxed. So these are some of the general benefits of laughter. So I guess my challenge for you this week, try to do something where you have a really good laugh, whether it is hanging out with friends and talking about fun stuff or amusing stuff. Maybe going to a movie or maybe a play, a comedy at a community theater. Do something this week where you're going to have a good chuckle, because that's what enhances not only our physiological well-being, but our mental well-being. So that's my tip for today. Well, my guest for today is Jill Littrell. She's actually going to talk about the mind-body connection. That's why I thought I would suggest this as the mental health tip for today. I thought that this would be a good segue into our interview with Jill. So without further ado, here is Jill. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I am joined today by Jill Littrell, who is a social work educator and clinical psychologist. And Jill, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Well, why don't you share with the mental note takers a little bit more about who you are and the type of work that you do?
Okay. Well, currently I'm a teacher,
All right.
and I teach substance abuse classes. I've taught psychopathology. I teach therapy and social work interventions, and I also teach research. Let's see, in terms of my background, I've been around for a long time, and good or bad. I started out working in a state hospital, and I worked there both as a social worker and as a ward aide. So, you know, I'm familiar with how people live 24/7
Yes.
in such environments. I worked as a child protective services worker for a while. I ran a home for adolescent delinquents for a time. And then after getting my PhD in clinical psych, I worked at the VA in the alcoholism unit, and then I worked at Cigna Health Plan in the alcohol and drug dependency department. And subsequent to that, I've worked with people with substance abuse problems off and on. But primarily now, what I do is teach. Let's see. In terms of training, I've been trained in motivational interviewing, Gestalt therapy, transactional analysis. In school, I learned behavioral orientation. I rely a lot on solution-focused therapy. And I'm also, attend assiduously any workshop I can. I'm a big fan of Don Meichenbaum, let's see, David Burns, and, those are the luminaries that come to mind right now. So.
Well, boy, you have a lot of diverse experiences, and also your training and your orientation sounds like it's quite diverse, eclectic as well. TA. I mean, I haven't heard TA for many years, and I wonder. I want to hear a little bit more about that, because some of our audience may not even be familiar with transactional analysis. It was very popular, I think, starting in the 60s and 70s, and you don't hear about it much anymore. I practice with a couple of people who actually still continue to use that approach, and I want to hear a little bit more about that as we go along. But before we get to that, Jill, tell us a little bit about why you entered the helping profession. What's your story? What got you involved in this area?
When I thought back on that, it's kind of hard for me to identify my motivations initially. I think I've always been interested in people, and to get to undergrad school, I worked in a state hospital, and there, at the time as an undergraduate, I wanted to become a social worker, and I did become a social worker.
Yeah.
And then, what I was struck by in social work was there just wasn't enough meat on the bones and explanations. And so I went back to grad school and got a degree in clinical psych. And and then, worked in alcohol and drug dependency. And, what I became aware of was, I looked at, when I worked in substance abuse, all of these family members who had been through very hard times. And I wondered, what's the best approach for working with people who've been through hard times? And that led me into psychoneuroimmunology. And I realized that, the real crux of the matter here is how you explain to yourself what's happened to you and the events that have been stressful and traumatic. What's going to be the best outcome for your physical health? And that really, in exploring those issues, I decided I needed to know a lot more about physiology, and that led me to enter. I've been, since entering academe, I took, biochemistry. I took a lot of immunology, and then after I earned tenure at Georgia State, I went back and got a master's degree in biochem.
Holy cow.
And what I got into then is the exploding area in what's probably best fits under the rubric of psychoneuroimmunology about physical health and inflammation.
Yes.
And there's a big story about both psychosis and depression, anxiety, distress being associated with inflammation. And I can get into the specifics of that research because I think it's important. But basically, if you eat non-inflammatory diet, and if you exercise regularly, you're going to be a lot more resilient to the stress that you might experience. And then complementary to that, it's also known that negative experiences increase inflammation. And so there's this exploding literature on, basically everything you would do to prevent cancer and everything you would do to prevent heart disease also makes you much more resilient to whatever mental stressors are going to be presented in your life. And so what my book is about is my book, Neuroscience for Psychologists and Other Mental Health Professionals, is, pretty much the story of how inflammation is the culprit behind psychosis and hearing voices, and then is also a major factor in creating anxiety. Depending on the inflammatory markers in your system, that predicts who's going to develop PTSD after a bad situation, exposure to trauma. So all of these, various fields are converging around the story of inflammation and then what you do about it.
That's fascinating. It's I had heard of a theory, and I think some of our listeners may be familiar with this. It's called the diathesis stress model,
right?
And it's very similar to, I think, what you're talking about, where people have this genetic predisposition to displaying particular types of mental disorders, but those disorders aren't necessarily developed or displayed or exhibited unless they're under some stressful life event. And I'm wondering how the notion of inflammation kind of figures into all of that.
Okay. It does, and this work comes from animal models, of course, because the variables are easier to manipulate in animals, but it's also consistent with what you see in people. And here, I think in biology, there's this explosion around gut microbiota. And you've probably heard, we are not alone. There's more bacteria in your body than you've got cells of your own. And depending on, the gut microbiota you've got, it's going to predict how you respond to stress. It's going to predict, whether you easily gain weight. It's going to predict, just a range of things. And, I don't know, if you want me to get into what you do about all this, because I can.
At some point I will want you to get into that. And the thing that I wonder about is when you look at people who have different types of disorders, whether it's PTSD or depression or anxiety, schizophrenia, do they share anything in common physiologically from this inflammation perspective? Do they share anything in common along those lines, Jill?
Yeah, inflammation is a big factor in just about every disorder in the DSM. Yeah. And what my book does is to go through systematically, the each disorder and, provides the evidence for the case for inflammation. And, you can't just say that you can say, inflammation is the proximal cause. What you can't say is that what happens to you doesn't make a difference. Because, of course, what happens to you impacts inflammation. And, a little example here, Matt Lieberman and Naomi Eisenberger, who are at UCLA, they have this little, computer game where they take, research participants and have them, play a, mock game where they're tossing the frisbee, and then all of a sudden the research participant gets excluded. And what they find is that when they image their brains, you see all the distress areas light up. And if you take a blood draw and look at inflammatory markers in serum in the blood, those go up. And so just this little intervention of being socially excluded in what might seem like a trivial way actually has pretty profound impact. And anyway, what these same researchers did was they had some of their research participants take aspirin first, and guess what? No distress areas in the brain lighting up, no inflammatory markers, meaning that that inflammation has a big impact on how you're going to respond.
So what would this mean for the general, therapist, social worker, psychologist who's out there doing their work like they usually do with their clients? And how do they use this knowledge about these things that you're talking about? How do they use this knowledge in their work, their everyday work with clients?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I've got two answers to it, or two. Part of what my book is about is that we've got with the Affordable Care Act, the idea is to integrate behavioral health into primary care, and and in primary care. You can talk to people about, diet. And I think, what my book does is to, we aren't nutritionists, but boy, the message on what to do and not to do is actually fairly simple. And, that you want to eat lots of fish because there's big literatures on, depression and omega-3s, which is in fish. And then, the other part is, stay away from the fast foods. And one of the people at my university, Andrew Gerwitz, he looks at the impact of preservatives that they put in all kinds of foods to extend shelf life. Turns out those preservatives just wreak havoc with your microbiota. So, you want to avoid those kinds of foods. And, basically I think, we can do a lot on the physical end of things. Of course, exercise, yoga has a lot of positive impact, not only on physical health, but mental health. And then, so there's, I think we all need to, kind of get geared up on, the physical health story. And then, the counterpart to that is the field of mental health, and then how you respond to challenges in your life. And you were curious about transactional analysis. And to me, why transactional analysis is so relevant is transactional analysis is all about the stories that are our own personal narratives and who we think we are. Whether you see yourself as out of control and the pawn of others, or whether you see yourself as in control and able to influence events in your life and what happens to you. And I think, for people who have been through a hard time, where they might be focused is what life has done to them rather than having a sense of agency, of I call the shots. And I think counseling, much of what you're doing is helping people to, and what Don Michelbaum talks about, telling the rest of the story, which is that you're resilient, you're here, you do have strengths, and helping to remind people that this is part of their narrative as well, is how you help people adjust.
Right. So getting back to the physical aspect, the things that you were talking about seem to be very basic and very doable. I mean, looking at things as simple as diet, and it's really interesting that diet and exercise have become much more, I guess, popular in recent years in terms of its impact on mental health. So I'm glad to hear you mention that. And eating fish. And
let me just put in a few more, because, I'm also a social worker, and I think what that means is you're very much, in social work training, aware of the life that people may be living. And so simple things like exercise aren't so simple if you've got 2 jobs,
This is true.
and 3 kids, and you're trying to figure out how to manage a very busy schedule. And, I see my students, and I look at, I usually teach classes at 4:30, and I look at, they're in a hurry, they're coming from work, and they're eating all the wrong things in front of me. But then you say, how else could you do this? And that's not so simple.
True.
And I think, part of what we can do in behavioral health is help people come up with some ways of making simple things doable, because depending on, your life situation, it may be a very hard thing to do.
Well, this is true. So, I think you have to look at everything in context, don't you? Because situations vary from person to person, that's for sure. So, but I really like this emphasis, because it's, even though mental health practitioners aren't dietitians, these are just very simple things that they could suggest to clients to make these very basic behavioral changes that could have a substantial impact on mental health in the long term.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you work with clients, I always ask my guests about their recipes for success, things that they've done in their work with clients that seems to have worked. Well, first of all, why do clients have the problems that they do, and what are the best ways to address those types of problems? So just kind of looking at the course of your career, Jill, looking at the clients, and I know you've had a lot of diverse clients, but just kind of generally speaking, why is it that people have the problems that they do, and what do you think are some of the best ways of addressing those issues that they have?
Okay. Boy, that's a tough one, because, so many different types of, I've seen, a lot of different clients, and, and substance abuse people come in because they've got, they're drinking too much, they're, using drugs too much, but for folks that are not in that category, I don't think distress comes out of nowhere. That we all meet, problems of adjustment, and things do happen in life, and it's usually when things happen in life, a loss, a setback, a disappointment, that you see people. And sometimes it's not living up to your own expectations, but then it's helping people find an avenue for getting back to where they do feel able to cope and do identify for themselves arenas in which they are resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and getting that sense of personal agency, as you were talking about before, I think is a really important part of that equation too. And
Mm-hmm.
you look at people who have adjustment problems and the different ways that they react to those, and also just the different levels of intensity and severity of those reactions to those problems. That can really vary too, can it?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can.
Yeah.
And yeah. What's going through my head right now is, solution-focused therapy. For most of us, it's one damn thing after another, and for people with problems, it's the same damn thing over and over. Right? and I think for people who come in with problems, that sometimes it is that they're going in a circle, and finding a way through the circle and out is what you help them to do.
Sure. Well, and in your work with clients, what have you found to be some of the biggest challenges? With all these clients that you've worked with, what are some of the bigger challenges?
Yeah, I'll have to, say that, with substance abusers, I think, the people I've known that, didn't improve, sometimes people really do have lives that are so difficult that, making a change, sometimes doesn't make sense. And, I think about, a client I had who had cancer and, was using alcohol to self-medicate,
Uh-huh.
and, he was going to die, and, sometimes, life deals you a hand that you're not going to overcome,
Yeah.
and certainly, for people who are dying, you can help them feel good about their lives and, say goodbye in ways that they want to say goodbye. But, in terms of the drinking goal, he wasn't going to quit.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can't make them quit, can you?
Right. And so, and I always tell my students, that when you identify goals, they ought to be the client's goals. And for people who I think make bad choices, kind of, what I want to do is understand why they made that choice. And, maybe it does make sense.
Say a little bit more about that, about understanding why they made that choice, Jill. Why is that important to find out from a client?
I think because it enables the therapist to walk away with the knowledge that they made a choice for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And as I tell my students, motivation is about valuing the goal times self-efficacy.
Uh-huh.
And the self-efficacy part, the sense of, yeah, I can do it, that's what I'm there for. That's what I know how to do,
Right.
is enhancing self-efficacy. In terms of valuing the goal, that's the client's part,
Uh-huh.
and we all have life choices to make. And what I try to do is to understand why whatever choice the client makes may be the best choice for them.
That's a good point, and I think that a lot of times, looking at students that you teach, because I teach students too, graduate students, and looking at things that clients do that might make total sense for them, it might not make any sense to the counselor. So I think asking those types of questions about what's the function of the behavior, what does this do for you, and trying to understand from the client's perspective what it does for them, I think that that's critical.
Now, I do too. Yeah. And, and in that process, you both can learn something.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Jill, this last part of the interview is what I refer to as make a mental note. It's something that you feel is important for the audience to make a mental note of in terms of improving their mental health or their relationships. What words of advice or words of wisdom do you have for the mental note-taking audience?
Well, I think, what I would say is, be aware of the importance of taking care of yourself and, things like activity and feeling a sense of agency and being in charge. And that may mean, putting more physical activity into your day.
Right.
It may mean, making sure you've got a healthy diet that's non-inflammatory. And then also, I think another big imperative is to get social support, because there's also, and I think that's another area where counseling can be very helpful, because when you're going through a rough time, sometimes talking with others. And, particularly, talking with others who are going through the same type of problem you're having. And certainly, in the area of physical health, David Spiegel put women with breast cancer in groups, and the women who sought social support from each other live longer. And I think one of the things counselors can do is to be facilitators in helping people seek out and then receive social support.
That's good advice right there. Yeah. Well, the last thing I want to do before we end the interview is you've made reference to your book a couple of times, and what is the name of the book, and how can people get it if they're interested in purchasing it?
Okay, you might check my website, and it's Littrell's Neuroscience of Wellbeing.org.
All right.
And my name is spelled Littrell. The book is on Amazon, Neuroscience for Psychologists and Other Mental Health Professionals. And, as I say, it's available on Amazon, published by Springer.
All right.
Okay, and, also, I am a social work educator. I teach at Georgia State. If you Google my name and the term scholar works, you can get to all of my, well, not all, most of my publications that have come out since the digital age.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure and put links to your website and to your book on Amazon in the show notes for this podcast. So if people want to get it, they can. And also your link to the Georgia State University website. We'll put all that on there as well. And Jill, thank you so much for being part of this podcast interview, taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun.
Okay.
Wow, Jill really knows her stuff. I'm really glad I had her on this podcast. The mental notes takeaway from this interview is, how people treat their bodies, whether it's, what they eat or how much they exercise, how much sleep they get. This plays a critical role in their mental wellness. So there's a definite mind-body connection that underlies mental wellness. So here's my question. What can people do to decrease inflammation in the body? Remember, Jill talked about this. Well, she said that inflammation is related to a lot of psychological disorders. She had mentioned psychosis and depression and anxiety.
Well, she said that if people exercise and eat non-inflammatory foods, so these are things like fatty fish like salmon, or leafy vegetables like spinach or kale, nuts, walnuts, almonds, fruits, whatever, then they'll be much more resilient to stress. So these seem like really basic things. Once again, it kind of relates to diet. People aren't always willing to do these types of things, but if you know that there's this direct link between mind and body, wouldn't you just be willing to give that a try, just to see how it works? Okay, well, if you like the show notes for today's podcast episode, then please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. Also, if you wouldn't mind, spread the word about the Make a Mental Note podcast to your friends and colleagues, and consider subscribing to it on iTunes. It's really easy to do. Well, thanks as always for listening, and have a great rest of the day.